Solutions Workshop. Oh, welcome, everybody. Welcome to our workshop on the Union Toolkit for Cooperative Solutions. Glad to see everybody arriving. I want to give a few people time, but I know that everything gets very punctual with a Zoom life. So while out of respect for everybody's time, we may have a slow start, if that's okay. So here we are, the Union Co-op Council of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. And Ray Cristiella and Ellen Vera, myself, are on that team, and we're here to give you a presentation. Welcome, Ellen. We're good. We're going to do our presentation, and you'll come up in a little bit. So today you're going to hear from myself, Rebecca Lurie. I work at the City University of New York at the School of Labor and Urban Studies on a project called Community and Worker Ownership Project. I can't even remember my own workplace. Ray Cristiella is with SEIU, United Healthcare Workers West, and Ellen Vera with Co-op Cincy. And we have an hour to share with you some ideas, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for Q&A towards the end. So our goals today are to really make sure you get a sense of what we think about when we talk about unions and co-ops in the same space. We're going to explore case studies and some lessons learned and understand where unions have led or contributed substantially to the formation of cooperative enterprises. And a lot of this is built off of a case study report that I'll put in the chat later when I'm not talking, and I'll make sure you have access to that. But while folks are gathering, and I see we are 13, so please use the chat, put your name, your gender pronouns if you'd like, if you're with a union, if you're with a co-op, and what you hope to learn out of the session. And of course, if you can, the land acknowledgement of from where you come. I sit in the territory of the Canarsie people. So again, Rebecca Lurie is my name, and I worked very closely with an intern, Bernadette King Fitzsimmons, last year, putting together a report on cooperative solutions based on a series of events that happened after COVID, where I was fortunate enough to be able to convene a working group for cooperative solutions, and it include union reps and people in worker co-ops and people in our sort of struggling for a just economy. We're able to come together and work, and we were able to put together a toolkit that we'll be referencing that comes really, it's really telling the stories of what already exists. I just wanted to clarify because I don't know, and I'll look in the chat, I see only one person put something, but I really want to see if people are with unions and what unions. That's who we think mostly comes to LRAN, and of course, scholars and academics, maybe some entrepreneurs and business owners. And so we wanted to sort of see who's in the room, but I think it's always very important to say when we talk about co-ops, this sort of important clarification, because I often say it's about who owns the means of production, who is governing and owning the thing we are talking about. Many people might be familiar, for example, with Land O'Lakes. You don't think of that as a co-op. It's not a worker co-op, it's an agricultural co-op where the owners of the farms belong to this joint entity. So a worker co-op is what we will mostly want to speak about today. And the two examples I'll give here is Cooperative Home Care Associates in New York, Arizmendi Bakeries on the West Coast. In those cases, the workers are the owners of the company, and the workers benefit from being part of running the operation, and then when it is profitable, sharing in that extra finances that comes through. Many people are familiar with consumer co-ops, and the reason I want to mention all this is let's not confuse them. Consumer co-ops, it's the consumers that own it, and they get to decide. So who owns and controls is always a very important frame of reference, and not always do you have the worker control in the other co-ops. Of course, we strive for that as worker justice warriors here. So I wanted to make sure we understand the class of membership is what happens in different co-ops you might be relating to. And when you think about that, of course, how deep is that power is always a good question. Oh, what happened to my slide deck? There we go. Is that the next slide? Here we go. Okay, so of course, if you're familiar with unions, you already know many things that unions do for their members and often on occasion for the broader working class. Not always, because sometimes it's very proprietary to their own members, and often it can be much more broad with their impact. So things like collective bargaining agreements, great for the employed circumstance with the standards, but sometimes it spreads out. I often say, thank the union movement for bringing us the weekend. All workers can appreciate the weekend, even if they're not a member of a union. So understanding that the unions do a lot to influence the jobs, terms, and conditions of employment in their sector, and more broadly when they can. Labor management funds are really joint funds of employers and the union members' dollars, and that does things like health insurance, training and upgrading, pension. And I wanted people to know that, because that's where unions pair really hard with employers to set some great standards. And in many ways, a strong and effective labor management agreement could mimic what happens in a strong and effective union cooperative. So I just want to give a moment of acknowledgement to the Framework for Just Transition, because I think I'd like to make sure we position our work in a broader context. And this context really is that many of us are fighting against an extractive economy. And if you see on the left of your screen, that worldview is consumerism, colonialism, exploitated work, an enclosure of wealth and power. And in a just transition, we have a regenerative economy where the things we think about are much more holistic and in sync with the things that everybody would need. So in that work situation and that regenerative economy, you have cooperation. And just to give this another broad context, because I just love the folks at the Solidarity Economy Principles putting together a set of principles that say, when we think about a new economy and the world we're moving towards, we really want to think about this. A solidarity economy rests on our shared values: cooperation, democracy, social and racial justice, environmental sustainability, and mutualism. And we seek to create systems that honor the independence of all beings and elevate the needs of those beings over the priorities of systems based on individualism, profit, and private property. Now, although this is broader than what we'll be talking about, it really is where we sit in a movement for long-term transformative social change. So a little bit to repeat, or to then understand what unions and co-ops do together, is that co-ops help scale the values intact in that business, and collective bargaining leads to clear expectations and clear human resource policies. And I hesitate to sort of human resource, but I'm using it because it's colloquial in our context. And there's a check and balance about how the democracy might work in a workplace, so that unions really help with that representation. There's the benefits. And many people in this room, I'm sure, are familiar with these different aspects, but understanding that when you're in a cooperative business that is unionized, you also have a direct connection to a much broader movement of workers in the same industry, and you're able to act on that platform of solidarity that I described earlier on the Solidarity Economy Principles, and you get to participate in a set of policies that advance the sector, not just your individual business. And I use this slide that I've sort of morphed from something I got from Ellen at Co-op Cincy, which imagine each company is its own little circle there, where you have worker owners, you have board of directors, you have management, and you have a union committee. And that union committee allows inside that company for someone to go outside the company and work with all the workers. And I think that really is part of an alliance that we seek in union co-ops, with working with the broader movement of worker justice writ large, and certainly with the labor movement as we understand it. We are part of that labor movement. So we were able to put together this toolkit from a combination of circumstances, but to suffice to say that in year one of the pandemic, we were able to have in New York City monthly calls where people were still getting warm to Zoom and were willing and really interested to engage in some learning that we could do together to think about how we're moving into this, the changing economy and systems. And what we did was we identified that there are really 7 tools that are universally used in all the different contexts that people go ahead and organize in. I might say 6 tools, and the first one being the toolbox, not one of the tools, but that toolbox is, the symbol really references the idea that there needs to be openness to innovation. Very important that people are open And there's leadership that says, we want to do this. And when leadership says, we want to do this, doors or boxes open up for all these resources to be put to work in some innovation that can really be where the workers not only are organized as a workforce, but owning the needs of production. So we look at other things that unions bring to that space. Understanding collective bargaining agreement, having professional expertise might look like lawyers, researchers, finance folks. There's all kinds. Other understanding a sectoral analysis is really important, and a lot of our unions do that to understand what's happening in different sectors. Access to capital and finance, use of union spaces, and also the training funds that can be expanded and used for multiple businesses. So we put together case studies in this report. And again, when other people speak, I'll put it in the chat for you to have. But in this, we say there's, with those 7 different tools, or 6 tools with the one being openness ahead of time, we are going to look today at the story of Allied Up Cooperative and SEIU United Healthcare Workers, where they were able to use different aspects of a training fund, policy sector, all of which came out of that open toolbox of willingness to innovate. And we're going to hear from Co-op Cincy and Ellen Vera, who will speak about when you really think about examples of geographic strategies using co-op developers, unions, social justice movements, and I might even add urban planners to really think, how do we do this differently? And how do we bring in lots of players? So the Union Co-op Council, this is the Co-op Cincy's grouping of unions that they've worked with, and we'll hear more about that in a moment. What I want to say is that the Union Co-op Council is a collection of folks who work in both those spaces all over the country, and we meet every other month in a general meeting and have and it lets us really sort of share our learning and share our teaching and promote more that we can do. And it's a council of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, which is like the Union of Co-ops, and sometimes I say, or the Business Association. All those co-ops belong. And so as a review, unions fight for good standards and can support the creation of co-ops as best in class. Really important to honor good companies. And as a single company, they can be a high road company, but they are a single company. And so a union works with many companies to establish and maintain high standards. And that's really what we pair up with. So it's not an either or. We like to say that unions and co-ops, they exist and influence in different spheres, but they can overlap. And when they do overlap, you have a really strong process of solidarity, because you're making payday on Friday with people coming forward with the best ideas of what they need to do to make their company run. And so we say solidarity forever on that. And I'll just add with this quote, which was one of the very senior union presidents who was attending the working group when we ran it. And he says, it doesn't matter what work you do. You're entitled to live a decent life. And that is the cooperative movement. That is the labor movement. That is the social justice movement. We are in our own, we are in our separate lanes, but I think we all need to understand that the goal is the same for all of us. And to the extent we can work together, we should. And if I'm not going to, but I think of going back to that slide of the just transition. And it's sort of like, yes, we're all in our different lanes, but in those different lanes, we're moving from an extractive economy to a cooperative one. So I'm going to end with the slides and let us all join and hear Ray, Cristiella, and Ellen Vera each speak about their circumstance and what they've learned. And then we'll open it up for questions. And please, I'm not sure if it might be that participants are not able to use the chat. No. Kayla Estes Romero did put in the chat. So the rest of you, please add your name, where you're from, if you're with a union, anything else you'd like us to know. Thanks so much. Turn it over to you, Ray.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. Nice to be here. And my name is Ray Crisatello. I'm the Deputy Director of Research at SEIU United Healthcare Workers West. So we're a statewide local in California of about 100,000 allied healthcare workers. And for it looks like maybe this sort of, so far, some West Coast, maybe East Coast, maybe Midwest people, but East Coasters usually identify with 1199. We're sort of the 1199 on the West Coast. And the union co-op toolkit that Rebecca spoke about, which I'd really recommend reading, to me is like such a helpful guide, and partly because it's kind of practical and theoretical at the same time. As somebody at a union who has been trying to do co-op development as a union staff person, and one of the things that I found really useful is looking at examples like the case studies that Rebecca mentioned. And so I'm hopeful that sharing with you might be useful, the kind of case study or example of what we were able to do so far at SEIU UHW in helping partner to generate this, what's now become a healthcare workers staffing cooperative, Allied Up. So I'll give like just a brief bit of background on kind of how this came to be, and then I'll try to describe both the pilot co-op that created Allied Up and then Allied Up itself, which is now up and running. So just for background, I mean, there's so many reasons why union activists like us might be considering being more involved in co-op development, and why union co-ops are so powerful for, allied healthcare workers in particular, being the focus of my union's membership, and so also of my own strategic research. The things that were kind of happening in our environment and in the membership of our union that were like signaling that this was something we should be looking at were, bigger kind of workforce dynamics, like erosion of bargaining units, contracting out, which is a huge problem, even if contracting out is, disabled by a CBA, like employers generally just try to see what they can get away with anyway, at least in our experience. So trying to curb that misclassification of workers as 1099 who really are not contractors, but actually should be employees. And for healthcare workers, the scope of practice issues, which sometimes involves like jockeying around licensure boards, which can end up creating like issues for technical, professional, clerical workers in hospitals, where they end up with jobs that's not why they went to school or why they got a certain certificate, but they get sort of pigeonholed into like a lower wage version of, and kind of lower skilled version of what they were trying to do at no fault of their own. So, and then finally, I'd say just sort of like the explosion of gig work and platform work through apps has kind of infected everything, and healthcare is no exception. So that was one of the places too, where the idea of creating a labor pool or a labor intermediary that was, a counter to what's happening in the rest of the gig economy world, where was very appealing. So for instance, a labor pool that is worker owned, where the profits from the contracts that the staffing pool might get stay with the workers as opposed to being skimmed elsewhere. Those were that was sort of what generated this initially somewhat, I guess, academic project of looking at what to do, and then finally, thankfully, into like action and what we would really do. And I'll say too, I guess, because I think it's useful in rooms of people who are staff or members of unions in particular, that the kind of like conception of co-op, supporting co-op development for workers, I guess both unionized and not, it can be seen as an organizing campaign, a strategic campaign of some other variety, but it is helpful to be sort of transparent about the internal realities of how unions work. They're the machinery of the union, how decisions get made, the executive board or executive committee of the union having, rightfully to need to have a say in like, this is a priority of the union. How are we going to invest? Are we going to like look into, co-op entities? Are we going to actually try to create a partnership ourselves? So being kind of open and transparent about the resources of the union and using some amount of them to go towards this sort of development project, I think is something helpful to think about early on. So just to briefly talk about the what I described as like the pilot phase, because that actually was a key part of internally socializing this at UHW. The union helped 5 LVNs, the licensed vocational nurses who are in the union, already working in bargaining unit jobs, who are like very entrepreneurial and really wanted to create a worker-owned entity where they could do home visits. And essentially, thanks to the union's good relationship with a federally qualified health clinic in Los Angeles, the co-op, the 5 initial board members incorporated, created, this is with, development and sort of partnership assistance from the union, created the LVN co-op called Nursing and Caregivers Cooperative, and contracted with St. John's Health Clinic in Los Angeles to do specific type of perinatal visit, where the LVNs would go into the home as opposed to the patient having to come into the office to do these visits. And it was a way to test sort of the whole model. And very long story short, it was successful. Like 22 LVNs became worker owners of the co-op. They're actually all bilingual. They came from the community in South Los Angeles where the clinics are. So it was a great fit. And the sort of like outcome measures like adhesion rate for appointments and things like that were all pretty exceptional. And the clinic was happy with it too. The clinic could bill Medi-Cal for reimbursement for those visits because LVNs can be supervised remotely by a physician. So the LVN could go into the home, create a billable encounter, and the patient doesn't have to leave and deal with, childcare or transportation issues that might prevent them from coming in. So that was kind of that, plus I'd say other just, relational conversation, socializing stuff that was helpful at the union, but also honestly, the realities of the pandemic, creating like a pressure cooker for all these issues, especially with healthcare workers. I mean, like respiratory techs, workers were like, there's just not enough of them. And it's this total crisis. That's kind of what generated the next phase, which is a multi-classification staffing cooperative called Allied Up. So this launched in March 2021. Again, the union was a partner in like developing the kind of ideas and structure and what this could look like. But, the co-op, once it's formed, is an employer. And so the union is careful about helping up to a certain point, and then it's, set off into the world. And after that did happen, and the co-op hired a CEO and installed their initial board, they and then started getting contracts. They now have a number of contracts for medical assistants, vocational nurses, phlebotomists, a couple professional and technical classifications like respiratory and sonography techs. They all over California, but the concentrations are mostly in kind of big metro areas. Those workers, once there were 20 or so of them, they dropped cards and unionized with UHW. And then within, I guess, 3 months, bargained their first collective bargaining agreement, which has now been ratified. So there's, I think like 48 or so worker owners right now. And I guess the final piece that I'll just mention is kind of the critical role of education and training funds, I think, to this process of like looking at the labor pipeline. So SEIU UHW has Taft-Hartley like incumbent workers education fund. So our current members access that, and it's big and powerful. It's been around for decades, and it's wonderful. And they do career pathway development, and they do apprenticeship, and that's great for our current members to get into wage growth and higher paid positions, and also to have housing stability where they are so that their wages can keep up with where they're living, especially places like San Francisco. So that's been around for a long time. And now Allied Up, because the Allied Up CBA has a provision paying into, by payroll deduction, paying into the ed fund. So Allied Up workers in the Allied Up co-op have access to the education fund now. So if you're an MA and you're interested in becoming an LVN, and maybe ultimately you want to be an RN, there's training funds that you can access as a co-op member. And then separately, there's a non-incumbent training fund created through UHW's collective bargaining process last round with Kaiser that created a 501c3 called Futuro Health. And at least initially it's been offered to like friends and family of union members, but it's essentially for anybody. And the bigger vision, this is still stepping out now, but the bigger vision was that folks who go into Futuro Health for some healthcare certificate or licensure, once they pass their exams and go through all their schooling requirements, that they get placed in the co-op for their first job and potentially for a long-term job. So there's like a built-in pathway for folks to get into both the union and the co-op, and also feel some amount of identification and like stickiness with having been brought, you know, that sort of career trajectory by both the union and the co-op, so that folks kind of like identify with that in a way that's hopefully useful for their activism and like interest in benefits. So, okay, I think I'll pause there. And I think we'll hand it next to Ellen.
Yeah, and let me just say, everyone, populate some questions. You can either use the chat or just use your own notepad, and we'll go for another 10 or 15 minutes and then open it up.
Okay, and I was gonna share a few slides, but it's saying that I don't have that ability, so I can just talk if not.
I can do that.
Okay, that'd be great. I think it'd be helpful, but maybe while you're enabling that, so just a little bit of background about myself. So I come out of 11 years in the labor movement as an organizer and an organizing director. And for me, I would say, I guess, 8 of those 11 years, I was doing both co-op organizing and traditional organizing. And it was just so important because it made it so that I had all the tools at my disposal to really try and uplift the workers in the industries I was working in terms of helping them to create, you know, a better job, a better life and whatnot. So in addition to doing the defensive work, you know, the fight back work, the super necessary work of organizing shops that were, you know, not treating their workers well, I was also being able to proactively create the types of workplaces that we wanted to see in these industries. So, so that's a little bit of my background. I was with the United Food and Commercial Workers and the Communication Workers of America. I have been doing union co-op organizing for about 11 years, and Co-op Cincy has been around about 10 years. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about organization and some of our co-ops and a little bit about our process. So Co-op Cincy, we are a nonprofit 501c3 cooperative business organizer and network, incubator and network, I guess is what I should say, incubator and network. And so we help to create worker-owned businesses, unionized worker-owned businesses, and then support those businesses over the long term, all with the goal of creating family-sustaining jobs in our communities. We currently have 14 different businesses that are in our network. This ranges everything from, you know, food and farming to construction to residential cleaning to childcare and a whole bunch of other industries. And we do this in a multitude of different ways, but kind of our services that we offer include, we do co-op education and culture building. So we have a 14-week co-op boot camp. We're actually going to be launching a co-op boot camp this fall in September that's going to be focusing on construction. So if anybody's interested in that and launching a construction co-op, look me up after this. We also help transition existing businesses to worker ownership. So businesses that have been around, typically it's an owner that's retiring, but helping them to sell to their workers and walking them through every single step of that process. And then we also, we have a loan fund where we help to capitalize a lot of these initiatives that come through our boot camps and through our transitions. So those are the main things. And then once they become, worker owned, then we support them kind of every step of the way. So we have wraparound technical assistance. We meet with them every single week and, help them kind of cultivate that co-op culture, that democratic culture, right? Where we're truly engaging all voices within the co-op and helping people really exercise that democratic muscle. We also meet with their management teams each week, and we serve on their boards, all to help them thrive and create the best jobs possible. I'm going to go through some of our co-ops, highlighting some of them, especially the ones that are currently union. So we have Our Harvest, which is the first co-op that we created. It's a worker-owned farm and food hub. They have 10 to 14 workers, depending on, kind of what's going on in the season. So they're very seasonal, and they are, really doing regenerative agriculture. They've been around, now going on this will be their 10th year. And they're union with United Food and Commercial Workers. We also have the Standergy Cooperative, which is a construction company, residential construction. So they do residential insulation and solar. They've been around since 2014, also have 10 workers, led by a lot of immigrants, and are just doing really well. This is the co-op that Co-op U in the fall. It's going to be focused on construction. It's going to be about how do we expand this really successful co-op to other parts of the country. So yeah, it's going to be a really fun boot camp. And they are union with the steelworkers. Co-op Cincy is also union with the steelworkers early on. We have the Cincy Cleaning Co-op, which has been launched by a group of Guatemalan and Mexican immigrants, predominantly women, who are doing residential cleaning. They currently have 3 full-time workers and 2 part-time workers, and are just growing very quickly. And they're working to get unionized with the steelworkers. And we also have a childcare center that has recently transitioned. So we help the workers at this childcare center buy the business from the owner. And they currently have 12 staff. 5 of them decided from the get-go to become worker owners. And they're looking at unionizing with Cincinnati Federation of Teachers. And this one was really fun and exciting because it came out of kind of a really interesting kind of multi-pronged campaign that was going on with the teachers union. So where we were one of those partners. And so while they were working and fighting to push for higher wages and benefits within the childcare industry and unionized non-union childcare centers, we were helping to create, union co-op childcare centers as kind of an example. This is the type of business we want to see. So these are, as Rebecca mentioned, some of the other labor partners that we've also worked with on strategic campaigns or have served on our board. We do have the head of the AFL-CIO and the head of the Steelworkers on our board currently. And I just want to kind of tie this all back to like the big vision of what kind of has really inspired Co-op Cincy. And that is, for some of you, many of you I'm sure are aware of it, but is one of the most successful group of worker-owned co-ops in the world, called Mondragon in the northeast region of Spain. And so in 2009, Mondragon and the Steelworkers Union made an agreement to start really trying to work to launch these union co-ops in the United States. And so we were one of the first groups to really bring this historic agreement to life. And I think one of the reasons I think as union people, this was so important and exciting was that, they went from, starting with one small co-op right after the Spanish Civil War, where there was over 50% levels of employment and poverty levels, to, within 25 to 30 years, taking the small co-op of 5 people to now having over 80,000 people employed today. And within 25 to 30 years, really getting to full employment within that region. And so that is the type of change that motivates all of us, and really, I think, speaks to the power of having an interconnected network of worker-owned businesses, and how that can truly transform a whole region. So they've been able to, when we were visiting them back in, the kind of the Great Recession time, 2008, 2009, even though Spain was at 30% unemployment, in this region of Spain was only 5% because of all the things that they've been able to do, creating their own economy. I just want to speak a little bit about our way that we go about forming union co-ops. So first we really start off and we think about like the industry that we want to be in and kind of the partners that we want to have, and kind of which approach. So I really loved how Ray was speaking to like doing that research and really digging in to say, okay, what do we want to do? What are we trying to address here? We were really intentional about thinking about which labor partners are we wanting to, really work deeply with, and what is needed in those industries. And I think the other thing to think about is, starting up something new versus converting something that's existing. Both are really important strategies. But what I would say in terms of getting to large numbers, typically conversions are going to be more successful. Startups can take a while to get to that phase of where they're, in a stable place where they can really start to add a lot of jobs. In a conversion, oftentimes, you can start from a really already successful business model and then, hopefully really grow that business. But we do both here in Cincinnati. The other thing I just wanted to talk a little about is just kind of the different ways that we've partnered with labor. So it's gone for everything from, them representing the workers in our co-ops, and providing benefits. So as you kind of see in a typical way, but I would say what's not typical is it's not this kind of us versus them, right? It's like in many ways, we're all on the same team. How do we create the best business possible? But how are we making sure that as a worker in this business, we truly are, having good wages, good benefits, good working conditions? I mentioned strategic campaigns of us kind of working right alongside a union as they're working to really uplift a whole industry and how we are kind of creating that proactive example. Also, we've had unions provide both staff and resources. So I worked sometimes up to 70% of my time on this project while I was working for the local, and helping to build these co-ops right alongside my traditional organizing. But also some unions have provided grants and things like that. We also had some really great labor partners that have been able to identify businesses that could be at risk, right? So where workers are seeing that, the owner's not investing in the equipment or the owner is getting up in age and doesn't really have a succession plan, they can, kind of identify, hey, we don't want to lose this shop. Can we figure out a way to approach this owner and potentially sell it to the workers? And so we've seen a couple of successful examples of that, which has been really exciting. And then we've also had many of our labor partners, like I said, lead on boards and be a part of kind of the planning and the thought process behind a lot of what we're doing. So once the co-op is formed, this is kind of how we go through the step-by-step. So all of our co-ops have, union neutrality language and card check as a part of their bylaws. Obviously, we can't force the co-op or the worker to be union, that it's up to them, but we put all of the kind of pieces in place so that it just makes total sense. So we do education on labor history and labor co-op history, a resource out there as well. In addition to the toolkit that Rebecca was mentioning, we have a worker owner workbook that kind of lays out, you can find it online for free or you can order your own copy, but it really lays out a lot of this history on the labor movement, around union co-op, history, around Mondragon, around, financial literacy, all the things that at least kind of basics that we use is when we try to really build that co-op culture. We also facilitate meetings between unions and co-ops. So when that co-op is starting to get ready to unionize, helping them find that right labor partner. And then we also have a lead union steward within the network that tries to help just kind of keep that continuity amongst everybody. This is our worker owner workbook, the Spanish version. And then when it's kind of time to form the union, we want to have at least 3 workers, or 2 workers and a board at minimum. Again, we try to find that labor partner that makes sense, whether that be based on the industry and or just the understanding of the model and excitement and ability to support. We sign cards, do that contract neutrality, card check neutrality, and then we work on negotiating the contract. As Rebecca was mentioning, this is just kind of a helpful model to kind of think about it, but just that, within our co-ops, not all the workers decide to be worker owners. And so you have a group that then makes the choice that they want to be worker owners, they want to own the business. They then elect their board of directors who are kind of looking out for that long-term vision of the co-op, the strategic plans and whatnot. They appoint managers to kind of make sure that the day-to-day operations are really happening. But then we also have this union committee that is overlapping between, the workers that are worker owners and the workers that are not, but are really thinking about kind of that specific place for talking about wages, benefits, working conditions, and how do we deal with conflict within our co-op, right? We're all human beings. We know it's going to happen. So we have to have a really clear process for working through those things so that we can truly live up to our values. And so just in terms of today, I think some of the things that are different, right, is that this is usually is a much more collective, collaborative experience, that we're negotiating in a transparent way. Like, we know how much, right, that this co-op is making, right? They'd use open books, and it's not about like, well, why can't you give us a raise, or what, you know, kind of making demands without knowing kind of what it can work for the co-op. No one's going to ask for something that's going to put the co-op out of business. So it's a much different type of negotiation. I think another huge thing is that access to union benefits, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, that so many of these businesses would never be able to access the great like health and welfare funds that we can, because we're part of this huge group of workers that negotiating for that. It's again that defined space and process for working through conflict, and then, you know, helping our workers so they cannot, you know, go out and be a part of all these things and work on, you know, changing the industry all by themselves. So helping them be a part of a broader movement that's really working to do that can be really powerful. So just last thing I just wanted to mention was that for any of you guys who are interested in really digging in more, so this is an awesome, I think, you know, foundation, but we've got a whole 2 days that we do every other year in Cincinnati. And so the next one will be in 2023, but we'd love to see a lot of you guys in Cincinnati as we dig into how do we really create good work, union worker co-ops. So I think that is it. I'll take it back to you, Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Ellen. So this is Rich, and I'm going to invite Ellen and Ray and myself to put a few things in the chat that we want you all to see, not least of which might be our email addresses. I'm placing there right now a link to the Union Co-op Council of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, because that is a place all of you can join and get on the list. And we meet every other month on Zoom to talk about some of these different issues. I wanted to shout out or underscore a word that is not always known as the word conversions, or sometimes transitions. So we know that when companies are at risk of, when an owner wants to go out of business, wants to leave, wants to retire or move on, they sell their business. How can we look at that from private ownership to cooperative ownership as a moment of conversion? So Co-op Cincy's been doing a lot with that. In New York, we're doing that around the country. There's a campaign called 50 by 50 that's looking at getting 50 million workers by 2050, if I have those facts right, or that vision right. But the idea really is, when we first brought this up in our in the convenings I held, it's saying to people in unions, you can be the eyes and ears of people to the companies. When you work for a company, or you're a business manager with a company or a shop steward, you might recognize that, oh, this company, this owner is ready to leave. How can we save the business and make it even better? So I wanted to make sure people had that language down. Another piece of language is co-op developers. A lot of people didn't know about that before. And a co-op developer is an agency, an individual, or an entity that really helps with the business development cooperatively. So we know what business development is. Co-op development is developing co-op. So I want to give that language. And then really honor the workbook that Ellen put out, that I know that Co-op Cincy spent so much time on, which really is a combination of worker education that we might be very familiar with in the labor movement, along with cooperative education, which sometimes overlaps a little with how businesses run, and understand we need people to have business skills. And also we need to have really like the best high road people management skills that we can pull together. What does that really mean? And I feel like that's where some of the revolution really happens, is how we manage each other for the best and most possible way of enlivening people's experiences at work. So let's open it up. Thank you. I see some things in the chat. People can raise their hand and come off mute, or I may call on people if I don't, just out of, I see some in the room who look like they may have some interesting experiences that they can reference. So I'll give you a minute. I'll give you a few seconds to become unshy and come off mute and ask a question, or I will. Everyone's tired. So I noticed someone from Chicago who worked with the teachers union there, or had an experience with the struggle in Chicago around teachers. And I wondered if you might want to say a little bit more, Ellen, of what's been going on with the teachers in Cincinnati, because that's an example. It's just one. I mean, really, I can spin the bottle and land anywhere and dig into a problem/solution where co-ops can happen.
Yeah, yeah. No, this was I think one of my favorite partnerships and work that we've done recently. So we had universal kind of, well, I guess universal preschool, but more funding passed locally right when Trump was elected. So this was the one bright spot that we'd had a levy passed. And so as a part of it, our local teachers union was really working to try and make sure that there was a promise that had been made for minimum $15 an hour wages for the workers who, that this money was supposed to be going to, but that wasn't really happening. So we were a part of a coalition that was trying to bring together center owners, the workers, and parents, saying that we shouldn't be fighting against each other, right? This should be a unified coalition of parents, educators, and owners, really trying to say, more money and money being directed in the right ways to early childhood education is really important if we're going to do this well. And so we were helping to kind of uplift the owner side of it and to really kind of help create this example of of worker ownership in the childcare sector. And so as a part of it, we actually ended up doing a report that that wasn't necessarily what we were planning on doing, I would say, in terms of co-op Cincy, but we ended up doing like an industry report leaning on some of the research of the union as well, but about kind of really trying to show them how they could do a better job of paying higher wages in terms of to our public entities, but then also talking about how co-ops could be a really helpful way to do childcare and early education better. So one was like a shared services co-op of helping, owners and childcare centers reduce their costs in terms of, food and supplies and other things that they were, bookkeeping or things like that. But then also just the ability or the importance of broadening ownership, to the childcare workers themselves. So I think it was a really comprehensive campaign where the union was pushing really hard to get the better wages and start to unionize some of the non-union childcare centers, while at the same time kind of proactively building the types of examples we wanted to see. So it was really, really fun and exciting campaign. And we now have one of the transitions we just did of an existing business was a childcare center. So and we've been also doing some things around nanny shares and things like that. So we've been continuing to work on that. So thanks for the question.
I was going to pick on someone who's already left, so maybe he knew I was going to call on him. Ray, do you want to offer something? I know there's so much to be said in more detail, and maybe, I can sort of shine a spotlight on the notion of different titles, the whole thing of how titles have been gigified in too many ways, and how you went and created Allied Up to create pathways for different titles.
Yeah, well, I was going to add something that's actually related to the chat question that just came up about, I think I know less about regional support sort of structures, although it sounds good to me. But any particular industries thing was kind of where my mind was going, which is that there's been like a lot of kind of new activity in co-op and union co-op development in the last few years. It seems like increasingly so, and I hope that that's a trend. And a lot of that has been in different care sectors. And what Ellen is talking about teachers just making me think of this. That there's a lot. It seems to me like this sectors and classifications that are particularly ripe are ones where workers are sort of the most deeply taken advantage of. There's the most room for progress and something better to be made real. And also sometimes both because of the way that funding streams work for things like home care or child care, and also the fact that they're typically workforces predominantly of women and women of color. This sort of a unique positioning of those workers and also a lot of immigrant and mixed status pools of workers, where co-ops can also be very helpful for that in terms of not threatening folks' immigration status. So I just think that again, sort of looking at like cases and examples of successful co-ops, like the biggest one in the United States is Cooperative Home Care Associates in the Bronx, unionized by 1199, and that's home care. That's the biggest unionized co-op in the country, is a home care co-op. There's Co-Rise, that's a child care co-op. There's Of course, Allied Up now is Allied Healthcare. And I know a number of locals that are looking at nursing home and long-term care. So yeah, there is something kind of industry related that I think is important to look at. And then in terms of like the intersection of, or maybe separate tracks, but they're sort of seem parallel in terms of like new resurgence of union activity, like, you know, Starbucks and Amazon, all this stuff that's happening in kind of bigger, much bigger corporate settings. And then also the growth of unions, of co-ops and attempts like those legislative attempts and other policy attempts to try to create scale and leverage for co-ops to be able to take up a bigger piece of the economy. Like these are happening at the same time. And you know, in the union category, the kind of like deep dissatisfaction and like, to me, the Starbucks and Amazon and Apple, like, you know, some of that kind of stuff just sort of, I think, screams like there's just some deep dissatisfaction and like level of mistreatment of workers that are, you know, historically get intimidated when they try to unionize. And of course that's still true, but that there's an opportunity there to,
Yeah, I was just going to add to some of that question around like the importance of regional support and where we see things growing. So I would say that when we are able to win, you know, more public support, public dollars for, you know, doing this type of co-op development work, you've definitely seen a lot more co-op development happening. So, you know, some examples are, you know, New York City, you know, Minneapolis, you know, Oakland, California, but I think Philadelphia, but where you're seeing like actual like public dollars going into co-op development, like that can make a big deal. You know, I think that there's definitely a lot of different places across the country that where, you know, actual networks. So not just like with the intention of saying, let's just go create one co-op, but where they're like, there's groups of people coming together saying, we want to create a whole network, a whole ecosystem of co-ops. And so, you know, we probably need to have some place that has a list of all these different places, but there's a whole lot of different, you know, networks, you know, across the country that are doing this in different cities. So, you know, you know, people have a question about a certain area, we can try to help connect. Like a lot of times, as Rebecca was saying, a lot of times they're called co-op developers, but oftentimes they really are focusing on creating, you know, a more kind of regional network. Yeah, and then go ahead.
No, I was going to say all that co-op Cincy sort of helps set the tide to sort of say, this is what we'll call it. We have co-op Jackson, co-op Humboldt. I know some people want to do co-op Astoria, co-op Brooklyn. There's a lot of that. There's two things I wanted to say. One of that is in New York, and I could speak a lot to some of what's been happening around the public policy push, but without something like co-op Cincy, which had so much union backing, we're still struggling with that. You know, what's the union role? So Cooperative Home Care Associates unionized 15 years into its existence, partly and a lot because they understood that they didn't have the power they needed in the marketplace, which is basically state money comes down for that kind of healthcare. How are they going to make it more money so people could get more wages? And so it was unionizing that gave them access to policy and, you know, really get in there and get involved with state policy, as well as the benefits, which really are wonderful with sort of now you get the benefits of that training fund and you can advance within the healthcare sector. So we see that example, and that's written about in the toolkit as well. But the other thing it's not written about yet, but it's the notion that there are social determinants of health that people may know about as a term. It's exactly what it sounds like. You know, if people are poor, they're not as healthy. If people don't have time off, they're not as healthy. If people don't have healthcare, they're not as healthy. So the social determinants of health tie very closely to good jobs and good work. And we have in Brooklyn a significant healthcare initiative that's taken some of their healthcare money. The hospital network of One Brooklyn Health with a few other hospitals has gone out and brought money directly to support the development of co-ops as part of the strategy for to improve social determinants of health. And that's also included like helping with conversions of small businesses so people won't be out of work. More questions or thoughts?
I was going to speak to the question around like conversions through the right of first refusal.
Oh, good.
right of first refusal positions. I can't even read it in CBAs. So what I would say is I think that can be really powerful. I think that and I think it would be powerful if you had, you know, legislation that was promoting that. I think the thing that can be challenging with that is that if you're kind of, you know, in some ways that can sometimes be more of like a hostile takeover type of thing. And that can be very hard sometimes to actually do effectively. Like the only real example that we have of, you know, workers taking over a factory and like turning it into a co-op is with Republic Windows and Doors. That's now called New Era Windows and Doors in Chicago. But they essentially had to start from scratch. Like it almost was a startup, or, you know, from after the workers did that, because they couldn't, you know, work with any of the existing clientele. Like they had to rebuild everything because they were hostily, you know, taking it over. But I do think that it's still very important for us to try and get within, you know, our contracts. You know, I think, you know, when we have the ability, but I think you want to craft those very carefully, right? Like you want to have some way to have like a fair market, like ideally like 2 third-party valuations to kind of figure out like what is the fair market value of this business, so that the owner can't just be like, well, I want $5 million, even though it's only worth 3 or something like that. So I think that if you can get it, that's awesome. We've been trying to use more of a carrot approach than versus a stick approach, I would say, where we're like, you know, saying, hey, we want to buy your business and we're going to pay you a fair market value, and that it's not necessarily like going to be a struggle. And so we are, you know, a partner with unions to do that, but the unions kind of maybe helping to facilitate the conversation. But it's like this other entity that's like, hey, we're interested in buying your business and selling it to your workers. So, yeah, so I'll stop there because I know I have only a couple more minutes, but.
That's an interesting strategy to really think about. And as we promote it more, it becomes more known. So we want a lot of people in the union movement to know that this is an option when a business may be in threat of closure, not because it's a bad business, but because the owner wants to make other choices with their time and money. How can we step in to help save it? So there are stories like that. A few of them are in the toolkit, worth knowing and and paying attention to. And then that right of first refusal is a conversation that could be happening amongst unionists when they put together not just this collective bargaining agreement, but really as business managers speak with business owners, pay attention to what's available, or if that's an option, so that unions come in as an ally to the business to save it, not necessarily as to make it sink. Yeah, there's the Union Club Council of the U.S. Federation has put together some presentations. They're still honing them, but the idea is to get these presentations and go on the road and talk to different central labor councils and area labor federations around the country, so people get some of this jargon and awareness into their space. There's a number of different things on that you can find for resources on my website at the School of Labor and Urban Studies, Ellen at Co-op Cincy, and also the U.S. Federation Union Club Council. I put that in the chat. So thank you everybody for coming in today. If you have other questions, you can email us. We may have a hard stop in 1 minute, so I want to be respectful. Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Ray, for helping put this together. Real appreciative.
Thank
Bye,
you so
everyone.
much. Thanks for being here.
For having us.
Bye.
Bye.